All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Phys Ed Summit 2016. My name is Naomi Hartle. You can find me on Twitter at Miss Hartle. And I'm part of the Phys Ed team and the Phys Ed Summit team that's helping trying to run this 24-hour conference back to back marathon of professional development. So we just want to say thank you so much. This is the first session that you've jumped into. Thank you for choosing this session and checking it out. And if you've been here with us since the wee hours of the morning, we appreciate you. I had to take about a 15-minute power nap already, and after my next couple sessions, I'll be taking another nap later on. So we definitely appreciate that you're staying on with us and checking things out and just here to learn on your Saturday. It's pretty awesome that we have over, I think last time I checked, the amount of people that have jumped in or RSVP'd, we have 1,656 people. So that's a pretty cool number. We're up from 200 from last year, and the amount of people that just want to dedicate their time to learning, phenomenal. So thank you so much. A couple housekeeping items before I let Dean go. We are in the Tozzle right now. There has been a few kind of issues with Tozzle. If you find that the chat function isn't really going on in real time, just make sure that you refresh that screen. If the video kind of stops working, refresh that screen. If that doesn't work, you might have to jump out, jump back in. If that still doesn't work, it might be something on our end. Just let us know. Just let us know in the chat, and we'll kind of troubleshoot as we go through. So technology, you just kind of got to go with it and go with the flow. And then we do have a feedback survey. So if you want a certificate of attendance, we ask that you fill in that feedback survey, and we'll go from there and you can get that certificate. And yeah, all right. I'm going to introduce you to can I say my good friend? Because I feel like we're good friends.
Yeah,
my good friend, Dr. Dean Dudley. So I'll mute myself and go ahead, Dean.
All right, thanks everybody, and I wanted to thank Naomi and the Phys Ed team for asking me to present today. I'm actually excited because I'm sharing a bit of work that two of the other presenters on the Phys Ed Summit, Professor John Carney and Dr. Dean Creelars, have been collaborating with me on, and it's this idea of physical literacy. And what I understand, and I see all the t-shirts that you're all wearing with nice definitions written all over them. I hear people espouse the word all the time. It's part of our common vernacular. So I actually want, if you're spending this hour with me and you can stay awake, congratulations. But I actually want to challenge your thinking around this construct and what it means, and maybe what it could mean. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and there we go.
Perfect. And while you're sharing your screen too, I forgot to say, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just put them into the chat box. We'll kind of let Dean go, and then at the very end, we'll save some time for questions too. So perfect. And yep, I can see your screen.
All right, put it in screen mode. We're good to go, Naomi?
You are good to go. Okay,
so this is I enjoyed trialing this because this is a paper that's currently under review in Quest, the Physical Education Journal, and it'll be a paper I'm presenting in Europe next month. So you get a sneak preview to it, and it's this notion that what are some of the critical considerations that should be applied to physical literacy policy in public health, recreation, sport, and education agencies. Because contrary to what you might believe, it's actually a construct that's not just being limited to education settings. We're starting to see it pop up all over the place. So here's a little bit of a background to this paper. Some of you may or may not know that next month, the 8th of September, marks the 50th anniversary of International Literacy Day. And UNESCO is celebrating it under this banner of reading the past, writing the future. Now, what International Literacy Day does, it celebrates all the accomplishments that we've made in the last 5 decades around international and national engagement around this idea of literacy. What not a lot of people realise is that, literacy is essentially an English word, or it derives from an English language. So it's taken 50 years, and as you can see by this document, to actually start to understand what that construct means in, say, French or Spanish or Arabic, because they don't have equivalent words in their language. So when we talk about physical literacy, you can see probably why there's been so much conjecture and so much argument in this space. What I hope, and what I would really like to see, I'd like to see us in 50 years' time with a similar recognition, maybe 30 years' time would be nice, with a similar recognition from UNESCO about what we've been able to accomplish in this space. Because International Literacy Day is now celebrated worldwide, brings together governments, multi and bilateral organisations, NGOs, private sectors, communities, teachers, learners and experts in the field every year to celebrate this great accomplishment in our humanity. So Irina Bokova, who's the director of UNESCO, said this in her press statement: "The world's changed a lot in these 50 years, but it's our determination to provide every woman, man, with skills, capacities and opportunities to become everything they wish. In dignity and respect remains as firm as ever. And literacy is a foundation to build a more sustainable future." Now, if I was to change the words in that to physical literacy, I don't think anyone could really argue with us that it's what we seek to achieve in our space as well. So some things have happened recently that have really put physical literacy on the agenda, and they're worth discussing. So the first one is this charter on the left-hand side. So late last year, in December 2015, UNESCO, for the first time in 36 years, actually released an updated charter on physical education, physical activity and sport. And there are 12 articles that sit within this document. One of the things it clearly states is that all vested agencies, not just schools, but all vested agencies must participate in creating a strategic vision and identify policy options and priorities and enable the fundamental right for all people to participate in meaningful physical activity across their life course. Now, if you hear those words and you look down at your physical literacy t-shirt that some of you are no doubt wearing at the moment, you'll see words like that start to jump out at you. You'll see life course, you'll see meaningful physical activity, you'll see fundamental right and participation. So there are some agencies that are critical to this. So no doubt I would argue that the sport agencies, our school infrastructures and institutions, and our public health system all have critical roles to play if this is going to become a realisation that these are fundamental rights for all humans. So this is what's been offered up at the moment, and it's quite conjecture, but everyone's searching for this silver bullet. What's the silver bullet that all of us can latch onto to solve this issue? And at the moment, a lot of people are going after physical literacy. We're seeing it in sport agencies, we're seeing it in education institutions, and we're starting to see it permeate in the public health sector too. But anyone that's been around for longer than, say, 15 minutes will know that the silver bullets are rare. Hence why I've got sort of the caveat there that they're only available in limited numbers. So I think we really need to examine what this so-called silver bullet of physical literacy can and can't do. And the first question we have to ask is, what is it? Well, what is physical literacy? And I would argue that the definition on your shirt doesn't necessarily describe it, because what physical literacy is all depends upon who you ask. And this was basically a 5-minute internet search to see, which sort of agencies are claiming a physical literacy agenda, and to be honest, they're everywhere. So, and they all have slightly different interpretations, some majorly different, some institutions have majorly different interpretations of the construct. And so I think maybe we can go back and build it from the ground up and see if it makes more sense. So why physical literacy and why now? Well, first thing is we have a bit of an international mandate. Not only does the International Charter I referred to before refer to this construct of physical literacy, it also comes out for us physical educators. It's one of the central premises that the quality of physical education guidelines are structured around. So some people would argue this has given institutions an international mandate to pursue what physical literacy is and how it seeks to achieve these goals. But I'm afraid we may have missed something. When I read the definitions in these documents, or when I look at what institutions, how they're tackling physical literacy, I think what we may have missed is actually what I said earlier. We have 50 years of knowledge in this literacy space. And before we can start to unpack physical literacy for our own means or our own understanding, maybe we should look at the 50 years of research that's occurred in the literacy space and see whether that gives us some insight into what effective literacy policy and practice does look like, because we have been incredibly successful in raising standards of literacy around the world and access to literacy. So maybe there's something in here, and that's what I want to explore with you today. So let's understand literacy. It's not new, but believe it or not, it's not well defined. It's not universally accepted as being what everyone thinks it is, right? If you were to use an analogy to survive the pub test, so if you went down the pub and asked people what literacy is, what the common person on the street thinks it is and what it actually is actually quite disparate. So essentially, 50 years of literature, we can narrow down into 4 threads of thought that surround literacy and the way in which literacy is built. And I want to explore each of these because I think early on some of it will start to resonate with you. So the earliest literature spoke about literacy being an autonomous set of skills. So the most common understanding of literacy is that it's a set of concrete skills, particularly cognitive skills of reading and writing, that are independent of context and in which they're acquired in the background of the person who acquires them. So concurrently, the notion of numeracy is on the same standing, right? Except that we'd say that's numeric literacy. It's assumed that an individual's ability to participate in society is largely dependent upon these autonomous skills, and failure to acquire them through a result of poor schooling or background will limit their participation in society. So what a lot of systems, whether they be educative systems or other social infrastructures, have tried to equip their populations with a minimum set of autonomous skills so that people can operate effectively within them. So with respect to physical literacy, the last decade has seen sort of a large amount of government intrusion into our education sector where the physical part of the body hasn't been as focused. I mean, if you're in a country at the moment who has been trying to raise test scores or health indices, those autonomous skills aren't necessarily been the focus. They have been the focus. There's been an overt focus on trying to raise reading and writing skills in our populations, and sometimes at the expense of accommodating other facets of learning. So these autonomous skills are what most people think literacy to be, the ability to read and write. What are those skills and how do you apply them? Well, the application becomes really interesting because the long accepted wisdom that literacy is only about autonomous skills negates something. It's the ability to apply these skills. So it's one thing to be able to read and write your language, or in this case, and most of probably people listening to this webinar are quite apt at reading and writing English. But if I was to take you out of your urban centre and drop you in the middle of the African Kalahari Desert, your ability to read and write English wouldn't take you particularly far. Does that mean that you are now less literate? Well, based on the context, you probably are. So because you can't take those autonomous skills and apply them in a new context, literacy also has to be seen as being applied, practiced, and situated. We see a lot of rhetoric as educators in this field when we deal with students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, refugee students particularly. We see they have particularly great language, reading, writing skills from their native country, and then when they are forced to try and apply that learning in new contexts, they actually have to go back and relearn. And quite often we can tag them with things as being illiterate, or they can be quite stereotyped. But that's not necessarily the case. It's the ability to apply those autonomous skills that they have in a new context. Sometimes we need to go back and acquire new skills. There's another thinking around literacy too, which is that, and educators get this probably more than our public health or our sporting agencies, is that, scholars that we revere, like Piaget, Dewey, and Kolb, argue that learners become increasingly literate, and they do this through a dynamic learning process rather than as a product of more limited or focused learning. So what I mean by that is it's the learning process that's important in acquiring literacy. So this is articulated, and many of you who have read anything about David Kolb, the notion of experiential learning and experiential learning cycle. You have a concrete experience, and then you're given the ability to critically reflect on it. And this builds our overall capacity to learn. So when we think about literacy as a journey, the way I like to explain it to people is that you don't start by reading one genre of book your whole life. I mean, you may have started out reading Dr. Seuss, and then when you went to high school, they may have given you To Kill a Mockingbird, because at that time in your life it was important to know about racial discrimination or tolerance. So there are certain literary texts we expose ourselves to at our life course. When you went to university, you would have read more academic texts and maybe academic papers. And then now that you're out practicing as a teacher, or you may read whatever it is that engages your mind. It may be blog pieces even, but what we read is indicative of where we are in our life course. I make a bit of a joke, is that when I was ready to get married, I went back and I read Jane Austen. Not that I'd ever had a great thing of reading Jane Austen, but it's my wife's favourite book. So at that point in my life, or she's my wife's favourite author, at that point in my life, it really paid me some benefit to understand where I was on my journey and the sorts of texts that I need to expose myself to. This means, to some extent, literacy is a journey, and when we build literacy policy, we must emphasise a critical role of what people are doing in their life course and how they can be exposed to different types of literacies and texts to then apply in an abstract environment. Simply reading To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a reason we get children to read, or adolescents to read To Kill a Mockingbird in those early years of high school, is because those are the times when those cultural barriers tend to permeate in unwarranted behaviour. So we try and expose them to texts so they learn about these things, and then that an abstract journey can occur in a child's or an adolescent's mind. It's the same. It's the same throughout their life. Many of you would have gone back and read Dr. Seuss, right? Does that mean you're less literate now because you read Dr. Seuss when you were 7, and now you're reading it again as 30 as a teacher? The difference is you're able to abstract or take some abstract messages from Seuss that you weren't able to when you were 6. And it doesn't mean it's a regression in literacy. It just means you're at a different point in your life journey. So the next one is that literacy is text, or literacy is power. And you would have heard that books are particularly powerful weapons in the war of ideas. And we see this in literacy all the time. There's a lot of researchers like Foucault, for example, who argue that we write to perpetuate power. And it's quite often difficult to detach the construction of knowledge from the power the power base that seeks to write about it. So I'll give you an example. When many of you would have been exposed to academic journal articles during your college years, but really we write as academics, we write in a particular way for other academics, and we speak a language and we write in a particular way for ourselves, because we build a power base around who can access that knowledge. And if you can't understand our journal articles, it's because you're not smart enough or you're not worthy enough. And there are other professions that do this too. You think about the medical profession, you think about the legal profession. You read a legal document, most people would just switch off because of the language that's used. And that's to some extent done intentionally, the literacy scholars would argue, to perpetuate a power base, that people, they substantiate their own careers and their own disciplines by allowing some people in to that language, and other people are actively excluded. So that's a notion of literacy as power, or literacy as text. So if we were to build it up, here's the foundation definition of literacy that UNESCO have, and you'll start to see some of those ideas start to permeate in their definition. The ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate across varying contexts. Literacy involves a continuum of learning. So here's the journey analogy: to enable individuals to achieve their goals, develop their knowledge and potential, and participate in their wider society. So you could basically take those 4 notions. So literacy as being autonomous skills, literacy as applied, practice and situated, literacy as a journey, and literacy as text. And if you were to consider, as any institution would, that if you were serious about improving the literacy and capacity of the people under your care or people who are engaged in your institution, you would address all 4 of these pillars. And that's how we would build an effective literacy policy. Well, I think we can make the same argument for physical literacy, slightly more contextualized, but I want to give you the conceptual work that I've been working on with my peers. So some of you may not know, but I published a paper last year that sought to identify, well, what are the core elements of observable learning that occur in physical literacy? And physical literacy should be viewed as an umbrella concept, much in the same way literacy is, that captures knowledge, skills, understandings, and values related to taking responsibility for purposeful physical activity and human movement across an individual's life course. And this should be a capacity-driven model. It should occur regardless of anyone's physical or psychological constraint. And so in that paper, essentially I identified 4 elements that we look at developing movement competencies, we look at developing a student's or an individual's ability to negotiate rules, tactics, and strategies of movement. We want to look at their motivational and behavioural skill set that they have, and then we want to look at the personal and social attributes that they bring to the movement experience. I actually think we can extend this to some extent and apply those 4 elements of literacy, those 4 pillars of literacy, and define them in terms of physical literacy. So most of you are walking, or some of you are walking around with this definition on your t-shirt at the moment. This is the one from Margaret Whitehead, is that physical literacy is a disposition to capitalise on human capability and affect motivation, confidence, competence, knowledge, and understanding, where we take value for the life course. So on top of that, I'd say our first pillar, if you were to take that into context, I'll just go back one. So I think literacy, and by default, physical literacy, does not necessarily progress in a strictly linear fashion. And I think that needs to be, it's not going to be something we can measure, just purely quantify. Rather, the focus is on the contribution and consideration that each pillar plays in supporting the construct. It's not good enough in my mind for there just to be a focus on one pillar and that pillar be used as in our understanding of physical literacy. So rather, I propose that there are 4 pillars: movement competencies, movement contexts, the journey of movement, and the power structures of movement. And if you're working in an institution or dealing with an institution that claims to have a physical literacy agenda, this model would, my model would argue that you need to ensure that the policies around physical literacy address, to some extent, each of these 4 pillars. Not one of them can reside, the policy can't reside in just one of them. So what this model seeks to do is show the significance that each model deconstructs and contributes to the concept of physical literacy. And only when you are capable of doing that can a common base of understanding be built based upon what we've known from the last 50 years of research in this field, but also that this model can then build new frameworks and new ways of understanding physical literacy in your own practiced context. So we'll build an effective physical literacy policy, and it should be one that starts to see across institutional lines. So if we can have a common conversation on physical literacy, not one that's vested only in health or in sport or in education or recreation, but one that's common, that sees these 4 pillars as being vitally important to be addressed in what we're doing, then I think the silver bullet may actually be a possibility, right? If we can start having a common conversation with health agencies, with sport agencies, then we're going to be in a pretty powerful place. So let's unpack each of these pillars. So just like the ability to read and write, those autonomous skills that they speak about in the literacy literature, I think we have a similar conversation in physical literacy, except we tend to put these around fundamental movement skills. And the fundamental movement skills are well defined in the literature, but they cannot be the limitation of it. I think we can't we can't just think about it in terms of locomotor stability and object manipulation. And those of you who read my my physical literacy paper, Observe Physical Literacy, there are other elements here, and we can't detach them off as being segregated. What we've actually got to think about them being is a bit like a bank. What we want students to have is many of these. We don't want them to be specialised. We want them to have agility, balance, coordination, speed, climbing, riding a bike, a skateboard, a surfboard, a kicking, all these things. And thinking about them not so much as there are essential ones, because I don't think there are. I think what there are is there's an accumulation of as many of these skills as we possibly can. Think about them as essentially a depository of Lego bricks, and you want students to have as many blocks, different shapes, colours, as they possibly can. And the more bricks and the more the diversity of those bricks that we can give individuals, think about the things that they can create with them. So we want them to have skills, absolutely. We want them to have movement skills, absolutely. But we don't want them to be specialised or narrow. And we don't want to think that this, by any means, is the only way in which we determine one's physical literacy capacity. So the second one would be understanding that it's contextual, right? So in the earlier paper, I state that movement requires a conscious interaction with others. Very few things that we do are in an isolated state. And this occurs because modern humans have lived in an environment in which physical activity and the associated motor skills were essential for survival, right? Especially in the terms of physical competition with other animals, including our fellow humans. So the context of physically active lifestyle in human populations, whilst it has changed remarkably, especially since the Industrial Revolution, those motor skills and the ability to practice those for survival has been taken out of our lifestyle. So what we're seeing here is now we're starting to see, the influx of non-communicable disease linked to, the inability to have that, to live that physically active lifestyle. So what people need is a context. It's the ability to have those autonomous skills cannot be in any way limited by very narrow contexts. So what we want to do is we want to challenge individuals to find physically active solutions to contextually relevant situations that they have in their life. And this has to be a central feature of physical literacy policy. It can't be narrowed to just physical education or sport or a public health fitness agenda, right? It has to be much broader than that. It has to be where am I at in my life, or what context do I need to apply these skills to? And to provide clarity around these is we want people to have the cognitive ability to understand what skills they have, what they need to be applied to a context, and if they're deficient in any of them, the avenues they've got to access them. So this is the ability to transfer. I just don't want to be a basketballer. That's not enough, or a footballer or a hockey player or whatever it is. Being good at one of these things is by no means a be-all to end-all determination of physical literacy. Really, a physically literate person is almost someone of the Renaissance. They can do it all. They're someone that can transfer from a sporting genre to a recreation genre, that can use their body for health and fitness reasons. And what they do is they see the bigger picture. And I like the notion of the Renaissance because it allows us to, the second one, the movement contexts are important because that's essentially what we want a physically literate society to be. People who can use their body and move in ways that solve problems that are presented to them in a whole range of applied and different contexts. So the next one that we've got is this notion that it is a journey, and this comes really heavily from Margaret Whitehead's literature, and that the journey is individual. So I go back to what I was saying before, we read books based on our life course, based on our needs. And the physical literacy or the physical pursuits I pursue when I'm 15 or 20 are going to look very different when I'm 70. Does that mean that I'm less physically literate at those ages? Absolutely not. What it recognises is that life goes through ebbs and flows. And there are particular points in my life where I'm going to be very active. I'm going to participate in team sports, or I'm going to participate in more competitive activities. But there are times when, gardening is probably going to be the most meaningful physical activity in my life. And as we're approaching spring here in the Southern Hemisphere, I can tell you gardening is fresh in my mind about things I need to get done on the weekend. They're totally legitimate pursuits of physical literacy, right? And understanding where you are in your life course and what are appropriate, and then working yourself backwards. Am I able to apply in this context? Do I have the skill set necessary to undertake these activities? And our policy needs to be reflective of the ebb and flow that is the human life. The final one is understanding that the power structures exist in physical activity. Now, this I think is one of the things that we need to address rather rapidly in this field, because we know that there is strong physiological, but more, I suppose, just as importantly, psychological benefits from participating in physical activity. Many of the post-structural scholars in the physical activity space have contested this idea, and the contentions afforded to power and the interests of agencies to control the human body and therefore create determinations about what is culturally acceptable pursuits of the human body. So the example I want to give you, and these are some important ones, is we do this all the time around somatotyping. We tell people that they will be particularly good at an activity, or otherwise we'll say they're not conducive to a particular activity and actively shut them out. I don't need to be 6'4" to play basketball, but people will, there are cultural norms that will say that only certain people should participate in certain activities. This, on a global perspective, these terms are most restrictive to women. Globally, boys are more likely than girls to attend school, and they make up and women at the moment make up 2/3 of the world's least educated adults. And these disparities have massive implications on their health consequences, and not least of which is around sedentary and active lifestyle. The gender norms that we place around physical activity participation, especially with women, have a whole range of other implications connected to class, ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, religion, and all these other human fictions that we derive social divisions into our societies. And women frequently represent the population that is most marginalised. And until our policies take very conscious action to remove these oppressive structures on women participation, then we're never going to truly have a physical literacy policy. We can't claim that there's physical literacy, or we have extensive physical literacy policy, unless it goes a long way to address some of this discrimination. The other one, the second most pressing power structure that I see under this pillar, is that of people with disabilities. I'm just putting these bits of slides up. So we see, especially in pursuit, people who carry some sort of disability are often the first, or frequently ostracised from participation in pursuits. And we need a paradigm shift to a strengths-based approach rather than a deficit one. So in other words, in recognising what people are capable of, not what they're not capable of. And what they're capable of should drive our policies around health, education, recreation and sport, and promoting empowerment in people to participate where they're at in their life, the context they're in their life, the skills that they have, and their desire to participate. I think access to sport and physical activity that should be afforded through this power structure need to also raise the standing of disabled people in our society. And this is a really important thing I think we need to start to address, because education and physical infrastructure, that we provide through teachers, physical education, and participatory sport opens the gateway to other civic participation in society. So physical literacy, probably more so even though the literacy, could provide greater standing of these people in our society. I think the third most pressing pillar that's perpetuated in this notion is the national cultural identity, and which populations or which people are able to participate in our physical activity experiences. And we, to some extent, put our cultural stamp on our society through the sports we participate. So I'll give you an example. In Australia, there's this particular prestige to sports like rugby and cricket and Australian rules football, and others. There's been the active sort of vilification, would be a good word, of people who participate in what would be considered non-Australian sports, maybe things like soccer or football or any of the sort of sports that were brought over with the increasing multicultural population spread of the country. So my argument here is, on Pillar 4, what we really want to do is create global citizens. We want to create people who feel free to travel in and out of a whole range of different activities and can participate and not feel that they belong to any one nation, to any one timestamp or identification about who they are. We want really a diplomatic passport in our participation in physical activity. So if we were to put these foundation definitions back up, we have our 4 pillars that I think that health, sport, recreation, and education agencies need to address if they're going to build physical activity. But now I've spoken about those 4 pillars, I actually think we need to go back and revisit the definition. And maybe that will come out in these policy implications. So if we were to build this model again, I think physical literacy now is more about, at least for policymakers, it needs to be about the holistic and lifelong considerations that these agencies place on the provision of movement experiences, not just for the individual, but for their communities and for their wider society. These are, for all intents and purposes, all learning considerations. And anywhere that they restrict an individual's capacity to learn across the life course needs to be seen as being contrary to a physical literacy agenda. So I just wanted, just to finish up, I want to go through each of these pillars and talk about some of the things that all 3 agencies, if you're engaging with schools, you're having conversations with sporting agencies, or you're talking to public health professionals, what are some of the things that you can discuss and have a common conversation about? Because this will be really the crux of this presentation. So in the first one, when we talk about those movement competencies, those autonomous skills, we should really have policies that discourage early specialisation. If these are happening in your schools, talk to your principals, talk to your school boards, as these are potentially very dangerous policies that restrict a young person's capacity to transfer across their life course. We need agencies, all 3 of these agencies, to collaborate in mobilising knowledge to develop wider movement experiences across the lifespan. So the first recommendation I would say, if you're talking any policymakers in any of these spaces, anything around early specialisation that will reduce the number of Lego bricks that people can accumulate in those banks, you've got to really speak out loudly against that kind of behaviour. When we look at the movement context, what are some of the policies that we want to start seeing in these agencies, sport, health and education? Well, we want to see ensuring that rules to participate are equitable and inclusive, that they don't shut people out, and that they get to see the tactical and strategic understanding that exists across activities. And they're given lots of time and the tools to understand and develop these. Not only should they serve the interests of one agency, they need to seek cross-institutional understanding. So it would be interesting to identify rules across different sports, different physical activities, and the strategies they use. And how do they apply what they learn in the school classroom into the public health sector, the sports sector, and vice versa. So rules around participating in fitness or rules around participating in singular sport, how has that been then informing the experiences that occur in the schools as well? I think if you're having any conversations around physical literacy, you need to promote interdisciplinary dialogue. It's no use for a school board to go down one path with physical or a peak agency to have one particular stance if they're not engaging with the other two. If a public health agency comes out, we've got a physical literacy agenda, or I'm doing some work at the moment with a sporting agency that wants to talk about this, you can't shut out the other two agencies. And agencies may need to examine their natural disposition. I mean, a lot of sport agencies like the notion of specialisation, but they can't be serious about having a physical literacy conversation unless they start to engage. Well, public health have a big role to play here, and they would argue against it. And I think we need to as educators as well. The third one is understanding the journey of movement. And policymakers can do a lot in this space by ensuring that their access to movement and physical activity can occur across different places and different times. I think schools, we're particularly bad at this because we deal with such a short period of a person's life course. You know, we lock the school gates at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and we shut up our gymnasiums. And I mean, it's a great physical infrastructure that we should start to think about, well, how can the local community and sporting agencies access not just the physical capital we have inside, but the human capital. Most teachers have 4 years college education and they understand these notions of human development probably more so than the community, other people in the community who are trying to impact on those agencies. We need the capacity to innovate and adapt our movement across a life course, and we can only do that by understanding that it requires policymakers as a group and not any one individual to see the whole person and the life that they're likely to lead. So we need active support and reject these notions that, and where it says it needs to be actively reject dualities of mind and body, is that, you know, it's only about how people, you know, their health status. That's not enough. We need to understand what they think and what motivates them to participate and what we're doing to address those things, address those aspects. And the final one is to achieve the physical literacy philosophical objectives. All these agencies need to make a special effort to transform the inequality structures that sit within them, especially around girls, especially around the disabled. And all three of these sectors should prioritise how their physical literacy policies facilitate these marginalised populations by either the overt structures that they have in place or even the covert structures. And we can look at the construction of the gender makeup of boards, the amount of disability representation that sits in those decision makings, or consultation that occurs with those groups when we try and devise policy around physical activity participation. So just to wrap up, our understandings of policy pertaining to physical literacy are no doubt going to shift in the coming years as this construct gains increasing traction within education, recreation, sport and public health. And we hope that this presentation, this paper, will go some way to recognise the growing awareness of the constructs that are impacting on physical literacy. We want to encourage it, we want people to acquire it, we want to develop it and we want to sustain it, but we also want to make sure it makes a significant contribution to the literature and to the policy considerations that are in place. In many countries, interdisciplinary policy making has been attempted, and it's too frequently never realised. And the reason for that is there needs to be genuine engagement around co-production of policy, and trying to develop policy without the consultation of these other agencies is never effective, because we always sort of protect our own. So what it demands is that a public good, we need to be having a conversation with these people as educators. We need to be having conversations with doctors, with coaches in the community, and getting those people to contribute and an orientation to, well, what's the bigger public good here? What's the bigger picture? Not just the KPI that's been set in front of me by my manager. And when we do this, it's not an easy feat. I'm not trying to be facetious in saying that it is, but it's especially effective when these agencies go to seek political support or further political support, and they're all on a common understanding. And for that reason, we can then expect more of our ministers and our agencies, executive, in terms of their leadership capacity and their support of it. So as physical literacy starts to become more popular in our vernacular, these physical literacy societies that we're hoping to build must be more than just any one of the agencies offering access to physical activity. And each of these agencies should seek to clearly articulate in their policy statements how each of these 4 pillars are being addressed. And in doing so, I think they'll be then well positioned to provide an environment of diverse, rich and prejudice-free physical activity participation opportunities across the lifespan. Some readings there that I used in this paper, and my contact details are available. Feel free to contact me on Twitter or through the Department of Educational Studies at Macquarie University via email. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean. If you want to, I was going to say, just take your slide off there and we can pop you up. There are a couple questions here. So folks, if you have any questions, as I said in the toddler, here's your time to pick Dean's brain. We have about, we'll say 6 or 7 minutes to go through some questions, and then I have to jump out to my next session, but here's the time. So Justin Schleider has a question. He says, Dean, why do you think as literacy rates rise, so do obesity rates?
I haven't, interesting question, Justin. I actually haven't seen any data that would suggest that. What I would argue is what you're alluding to, Justin, is as we become more industrialized and we can become more technologically savvy, we breed physical activity out of our lifestyle. Right, so to say something's correlated doesn't mean it causes it. We can't say that increasing literacy causes obesity. What I think you're seeing is more technologically developed societies evolve, and as we become more tech savvy, we can actively take activity out of our life course. The problem is that's not sustainable, not just in terms of our own health, but in terms of the planet. we consume more resources that way, and getting back to what we are is nothing more than another carbon-based life form that exists in this planet and needs to exist with other carbon-based life forms and others that aren't. The survival of the planet will largely depend on our ability to get back to what we are. If you want to read a really interesting book, The Empathic Civilization by Jeremy Rifkin, I suggest you read it. It's a substantial read, but it's also life-changing in understanding our need to connect at a very biological level with not just our fellow man, but the rest of the planet. It's an interesting question, Justin, though. But yeah, correlation doesn't equal causality, but that would be my interpretation of it.
Thank you. I was just typing in the toddler, sorry. So I was just wondering if anybody had any other questions. If not, I just want to say thank you, Dean, so much for sharing that information with us. I was trying to do some tweeting and taking some pictures and sharing some information out with everybody. So very interesting stuff. Definitely. Every time I hear you talk, I just sit and I just listen. I'm just like, just keep going, just keep going.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. That's a fairly, I suppose, high level, but idea to tackle with in this forum. But what it gave me is I actually need to go back. I actually need to think about how I deliver some of that material, because I can do that quite passionately, and it's hard. You can actually get bogged down in some of the more semantic stuff in there. But I appreciate people who took the listen, and I'd really, anyone that wants to give me some feedback about some of those ideas and ways in which I can connect with practitioners on it, I'd take that on board. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So Dean, one more time, how can people contact you in case if they need to contact you?
Okay, so you can contact me via Twitter's fairly easy, at Dean Dudley via Twitter. You can get me on my email, which is dean.dudley@mq.edu.au, and that's through Macquarie University. I think they're the best ways to contact me. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who was, able to stay here and listen to this. I think lots of people are just processing right now too. It's like, I don't have any questions yet because I'm still trying to process what I was just listening to. So if you have any questions later on, that's the way to contact Dean. But other than that, thank you for spending this hour with us, or 50 minutes with us. And thank you, Dean, so much for sharing your information.
I'm going to go for a surf, so I'll catch you later.
Perfect. Thanks. All right, thanks everybody.
Bye. Bye.